my brothers and sisters across Africa, and the countless millions around the globe who still believe in truth, justice, and dignity. I speak to you today not with pride, but with profound humility.
The world held its breath when the news broke. Interpol had issued an arrest notice for Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the fiercely independent leader of Burkina Faso. The announcement crackled through international news networks, echoing from one capital to the next, as incredulous journalists wrestled with the magnitude of the moment. Here was a man who had risen from the ranks to embody the spirit of insurgent authority, and now he was branded a fugitive in the eyes of law enforcement agencies across the globe. The weight of that title carried more than legal consequence. It was a weapon aimed at legitimacy, a blow to perception, and a signal flash across the world stage. It was difficult to overstate how unexpected the development felt. Traoré, celebrated by many for his bold domestic reforms and anti-corruption crusade, had become a symbol of defiance against both internal stagnation and external meddling. His approach was anything but conventional. He spoke of autonomy, of sovereignty, and of an Africa rising through its own resolve. The arrest warrant, deployed under the banner of Interpol, felt like a thunderclap in the sky he had long illuminated with his steadfast refusal to blink in the face of international pressure. Diplomatic cables leaked and hushed whispers hinted at what might have triggered the order. Perhaps it was his relentless opposition to certain foreign aid programs, or his decision to uproot entrenched agreements deemed inequitable. Perhaps it was a conversation overheard in the corridors of international finance or intelligence, pointing to a reckoning that global powers had decided to press. The warrant read like a formal denial of his right to dissent. It transformed him overnight from national leader to persona non grata before the law. But if the intention had been to isolate him, the response was swift and seismic. Emboldened by the world's gaze, Traoré reacted not with fear, but with fiery satire and sharp rhetoric. In a nationally broadcast address, he launched into a blistering oratory. They summoned me across borders to cap my voice, but they misunderstand the roar they have awoken. He invoked ancestral warriors of African resistance and invoked images of freedom flown high above rigid sovereignty. The world watched, some stunned, others enthralled, as he debuted defiance dressed in words that became slogans. Immediately, a chorus of solidarity rose. Citizen groups, activists, and Pan-African intellectuals called the warrant a farce, a colonial-era gambit in modern drapery. Social media became molten with discourse. Hashtags like hashtag defiance over diplomacy and hashtag Traoré bloomed with graphics and quotes. In cities from Dakar to Accra, impassioned demonstrations burst forth. In Paris, immigrant communities gathered outside embassies, while Nigerian commentators questioned what sovereignty meant in the face of international policing. From a geopolitical vantage, governments wavered. Some African Union officials moved cautiously, concerned that supporting Traoré might bring sanctions, or worse, onto their own states. European capitals issued dry, legalistic statements that Interpol was independent, that the warrant was procedural. Yet beneath those words, the tremor of unease was evident. It wasn't every day world officials found themselves caught between a global policing mechanism and a charismatic leader who had rewritten what resistance could look like. Analysts weighed in. Was this a turning point in the relationship between global institutions and sovereign defiance? Was Traoré a relic, or a new kind of public figure, one whose valor lay not in capitulation, but in courageously charting his own course? Headlines wrestled with him as a messiah, a menace, a man to be watched, framed in the vocabulary of both fear and fascination. Even as international courts mulled over jurisdiction and legal form, the man at the center of it all refused to yield. He convened emergency sessions of his cabinet, broadcasting them live to show transparency. He moved troops to secure borders, signaling that domestic order would not be sacrificed to external edicts. Western ambassadors summoned aides, who in turn tried delicate negotiations, the kind that traditionally pull leaders into back rooms and cloakrooms. But Traoré, it seemed, preferred to speak to his people through open channels, not through muffled statecraft. In the halls of African diplomacy, debates flared. Heads of state murmured that perhaps this was a moment for a new doctrine of solidarity, one that repudiated policing by proxy. Elsewhere, foreign ministers clashed over legal precedent. Could Interpol, a body founded on cooperation, be used politically to destabilize a sitting head of state? The quandary itself felt like the opening act to a theater of evolving global ethics. International human rights organizations watched closely, tore between concerns over the rule of law and respect for sovereignty. Reports began circulating, evaluating whether the warrant was based on credible charges or reflected political pressure. Their findings would matter. They could make or break the legitimacy of the entire affair. Meanwhile, Traoré's domestic standing surged. To the rural farmer in Ouagadougou, he was a hero refusing to bow. To the urban youth, he was a symbol, part warlord, part philosopher, part everyman at war with the system. The warrant turned him into more than a leader. He became an avatar. He was, in some narratives, Atlas himself, shouldering not the world but the weight of autonomy for many who felt crushed by global structures. All the maneuvering, all the speeches, all the murmurs and headlines, they meant little to him unless they served that broader purpose. When foreign journalists grilled him in sudden press appearances, he answered with rhetorical flourishes and ancient proverbs. His defiance wasn't empty bravado. It was calibrated, passionate, strategic. The world wanted him contained. He offered instead to reframe the definition of containment. As days turned into weeks, the warrant remained active, but its teeth seemed blunted. Countries refused extradition. Travel routes were rerouted. Diplomacy stalled. He moved between regional capitals, meeting allies, forging agreements, talks of mutual defense, economic independence. Regional diplomacy absent of Western tutelage began proliferating. One evening, in a gesture both symbolic and defiant, he invited village elders to plant a tree in the national courtyard that he called the Tree of Defiance. Cameras captured the moment. Sun setting, broad leaves, and children gathered in front, chanting praises. It was a scene that would later adorn magazines, become wallpaper on protest pages, and echo in speeches across the continent. The narrative was clear. Legal mechanisms were rattled. Systems were being tested. Centuries-old structures were being questioned. His defiance became a question posed to the world. What did justice mean when wielded by distant institutions? What did sovereignty mean when interpreted through the lens of power? In refusing to yield, he sharpened these questions and forced them into global conversation. Meanwhile, corners of the international community evaluated the fallout. Trade negotiations stalled. Security alliances shifted tone. Behind closed doors, legal scholars debated whether this case might set precedent limiting Interpol's power in matters involving heads of state. Some opined that the warrant itself, whether justified or not, had become a bargaining chip. Less about accusation and more. The days following the announcement, what began as a legal matter evolved into a geopolitical fault line. The international arrest warrant had thrown a spotlight on Ibrahim Traoré, but the light did more than illuminate. It refracted, splitting the world into fragments of opinion, loyalty, and ambition. Allies became cautious, adversaries emboldened, and neutral observers were forced into reluctant commentary. Every statement issued by a foreign ministry, every line spoken in televised debates, every article penned by an op-ed columnist now fed into the growing storm. Inside Burkina Faso, the air was electric. Cafes in Ouagadougou buzzed with debate from dawn until midnight. University students pored over international law in packed auditoriums, dissecting the limits of Interpol's mandate. Farmers in the countryside listened to radio commentaries between tending their fields, while truck drivers carrying millet across provincial lines plastered their vehicles with slogans of resistance. The nation's streets carried the thrum of a people who felt that their leader, however polarizing, had become the hinge upon which their sovereignty swung. Traoré, meanwhile, orchestrated his defiance with the precision of a tactician who understood both optics and strategy. He did not retreat into hiding, nor did he lash out blindly. He became hypervisible. Cameras followed him to military installations, to rural development projects, to impromptu town hall meetings where he fielded questions from ordinary citizens with rare and unvarnished candor. His defiance was not hidden behind palace gates. It was performed under the sun, before an audience that was both domestic and global. The warrant, ironically, had offered him a new stage. Before its issuance, his reach, though significant, was largely confined to his region and the circles of policy analysts who monitored Africa's shifting leadership. Now, His name trended in languages he did not speak. His image graced murals in cities he had never visited. In Brazil, graffiti artists in Sao Paulo painted his face alongside slogans against foreign intervention. In Istanbul, activists unfurled banners bearing his words outside a European Union summit. The phenomenon was not universal adoration. Rather, it was a testament to how resistance, even when contested, can become a vessel for many grievances. Western intelligence assessments, declassified months later, revealed a degree of miscalculation. They had anticipated outrage, but localized outrage, a ripple, not a wave. Instead, they had awakened a cross-continental conversation about the balance between global governance and national autonomy. The warrant, issued under the pretext of legal accountability, had been interpreted by many as political choreography, an attempt to discipline a voice that refused to harmonize with existing chords. There were nights when Traore reportedly stayed awake deep into the dawn, conferred with his advisors about the endgame. His defiance had galvanized, but had also escalated the stakes. Should he travel to a friendly nation, risking capture en route? Should he convene a continental summit to confront the issue directly, knowing it would further antagonize those pressing for his arrest? Or should he double down on internal transformation, arguing that the best answer to international pressure was domestic resilience? He chose, in those days, a path of layered resistance. While public rallies carried the visible message of defiance, quiet back-channel communications were established with sympathetic states. Some offered safe passage. Others offered economic lifelines to offset the pressures of frozen assets and suspended trade deals that began creeping in. The machinery of isolation was slow, but it was moving. Yet, the more the walls tried to close in, the more porous they seemed to become. A faction of lawyers from Latin America filed an amicus brief challenging the very basis of the warrant, citing clauses of international law often overlooked in the haste of geopolitics. Academics from Asia penned a collective paper framing the episode as a case study in instrumentalized lawfare. Even in Europe, protests broke out, not massive, but symbolically potent, arguing that global policing agencies must not become levers of neo-colonial administration. Inside Burkina Faso's borders, something else was happening, a quiet reawakening of civic pride. Citizens volunteered for infrastructure projects. Local councils accelerated their agendas. Artists composed songs that mixed traditional rhythms with lyrics about defiance and freedom. Whether one loved or loathed Traore, his situation had shaken the dust off a long-neglected idea that a small nation, if it chose to stand upright, could command the world's attention not through wealth or weapons, but through sheer will. The international media, predictably, oscillated between demonization and lionization. One week he was a renegade destabilizer, the next a folk hero challenging the hypocrisy of larger powers. Editorial lines revealed as much about the publications as about the man himself. In Washington, think tanks convened roundtables on how to neutralize the symbolic contagion of his defiance. In Johannesburg, analysts framed him as the latest in a lineage of leaders refusing to let Africa be spoken for. Months passed, and the warrant's shadow grew longer. It restricted certain flights, redirected trade routes, emboldened clandestine plots. Assassination rumors circulated, then were denied. His speeches became more measured, his circle more guarded. But the central refrain did not change, that sovereignty must not be conditional, that leadership must not be dictated from outside. One particularly striking moment came during a global summit streamed online, where an empty seat was labeled with his name. Delegates debated whether he should have been invited, whether his presence would legitimize him or destabilize proceedings. Outside, thousands gathered, some in support, some in protest, but all acknowledging that his absence was as loud as any speech he might have delivered. As the crisis dragged on, fatigue set in for some. Aid organizations warned that sanctions linked to the affair were hampering humanitarian deliveries. Business leaders complained of lost contracts. Even some within his government whispered about compromise. But Traore, ever the strategist, understood that defiance is a double-edged blade, too soft and it blunts, too hard and it snaps. He began to speak less of confrontation and more of dialogue, yet without conceding the principle that had set this chain of events in motion. His defiance stunned the globe not because it was theatrical, but because it was sustained. It endured past the initial surge of headlines, past the fatigue of diplomats, past the oscillating narratives of media cycles. It revealed something unsettling for the architects of the warrant, that enforcement in the 21st century was not merely a matter of legal documentation, but of narrative control. And in that domain, Traore was winning. Eventually, cracks began to show in the edifice of the warrant itself. Leaks exposed inconsistencies in the charges. A whistleblower within one European office revealed that certain evidence had been expedited without due process. Legal scholars published papers arguing that the warrant violated the very constitution of Interpol, which is meant to avoid political entanglements. The calls for its review, once whispers, became demands. The final act is still unfolding, perhaps in some